Everyone assumes the fear of cameras started with cameras. It didn't. The fear came first, thousands of years first, and the camera just finally gave it something to point at. Long before photography existed, dozens of cultures with no contact with each other somehow arrived at the exact same rule. Don't let your image be captured. Not a portrait, not a reflection held too long, not even your shadow in some places. Something about being copied was considered dangerous. And the stranger part is that some of them may have been right, just not for the reason you'd think. So here's the question. Why would a species that had never seen a camera already have a rule against being photographed? Let's go back and actually find out. First, we need to separate two things that get lumped together constantly: fear of cameras specifically, and fear of image capture in general. The camera is new. It's maybe 200 years old. But the belief that an image of you carries something of you, that's ancient. That's older than writing. And once you understand that, the reaction to cameras in the 1800s stops looking like technophobia and starts looking like something much older, simply meeting a new tool. Start with shadows, because shadows are the oldest version of this belief, and almost nobody talks about it. Across dozens of unrelated cultures, from parts of Southeast Asia to West Africa to the Balkans, there's a recurring superstition that stepping on someone's shadow or having your shadow trapped, measured, or built into a structure could cause harm or even death. In some Southeast Asian building traditions, there are documented folk beliefs about avoiding a person's shadow falling into a foundation pit during construction, out of concern the person could sicken. In parts of the Balkans, similar shadow-related beliefs existed around construction, tied to the idea that a shadow held something of a person's vitality. Now, a shadow isn't a photograph, but look at what it actually is. It's a flat, dark, two-dimensional projection of your outline, separated from your body, existing somewhere you're not fully in control of. That's the exact same category of object a photograph would later become. Ancient people had already built an entire framework of belief around exactly this kind of thing, decades and centuries before anyone invented a machine that could freeze it permanently. Reflections work the same way. Across an enormous number of cultures, mirrors and still water carried the same warning. Don't look too long. Don't let a baby see its reflection too early. Cover the mirrors in a house of mourning. That last one isn't obscure folklore, by the way. It's still practiced today in several traditions, including in some Jewish mourning customs, where mirrors are covered during the Shiva period. The stated reasons vary by tradition, but the underlying pattern doesn't. A reflection is not considered a neutral, harmless copy of you. It's considered a kind of doorway, a place where something about your identity can slip out, get confused, or get taken. So by the time cameras show up, humanity isn't encountering a new fear. It's encountering a new object that plugs directly into a fear that's already fully formed and thousands of years old. Here's where it gets specific, because the belief that a photograph could literally steal part of a person's soul, sometimes called the soul capture belief, wasn't a single myth. It was reported independently across wildly different parts of the world in ways that suggest it wasn't one culture's idea spreading outward. It was multiple cultures arriving at the same conclusion on their own. 19th and early 20th century explorers, missionaries, and early anthropologists documented versions of this belief among various indigenous communities in North America, in parts of the South Pacific, across regions of sub-Saharan Africa, and in remote communities in Asia encountering photography for the first time. The specifics differed. In some accounts, the belief was that the camera captured a portion of the person's spirit or life force, weakening them. In others, the fear was more specific, that the photograph could be used later to harm the person, almost like a physical anchor for a curse, the same logic behind sympathetic magic involving hair or fingernails. In others still, it wasn't about theft at all, but about permanence, a discomfort with an image of a living person existing independently of them, potentially outliving them, potentially being viewed after death in ways the person never consented to. It's worth being careful here, because a lot of 19th century accounts of primitive superstition were written by outsiders with their own biases, often exaggerating or flattening what they observed for dramatic effect. Some reported reactions were likely genuine unfamiliarity with a strange new machine rather than a coherent spiritual framework. But enough independent, cross-referenced accounts exist from different explorers, different decades, different unrelated regions, describing a similar underlying concern that most anthropologists today treat this as a real and widespread pattern, not a colonial myth invented after the fact. And once you see the pattern, the reaction makes a strange kind of sense. Imagine you've never seen a mechanical reproduction of anything. Your entire understanding of representation comes from paintings, which take a skilled human hours or days to make, and which everyone understands to be an interpretation filtered through a person's hand and choices. Then a stranger arrives with a box, points it at you. There's a sound, a flash of light in some early processes, and moments later there exists a perfect, exact copy of your face that you did not make, do not control, and cannot take back. From inside that worldview, calling that unsettling isn't superstition. It's a completely reasonable reaction to something that genuinely didn't exist before. Now let's talk about what actually happened when cameras started arriving in person, because the documented reactions are more specific and more interesting than most people realize. In parts of the American West, early photographers recorded resistance from some indigenous communities, tied specifically to concerns about the image being used against the person, whether spiritually or, later, more practically, as photographs became tools of government identification and surveillance. That second part matters and doesn't get discussed enough. For a lot of communities, the fear of being photographed wasn't purely mystical. It became entangled, especially by the later 1800s, with the real and justified fear of being cataloged, tracked, and controlled by colonial administrations that were, quite literally, using photography as a tool of documentation and power. The spiritual fear and the political fear reinforced each other. In parts of Africa during early colonial contact, missionary and explorer journals from the period describe similar hesitation, sometimes framed by the writers as fear of soul loss, though modern historians caution that these accounts often reflect the assumptions of the writer as much as the beliefs of the people being described. Still, the pattern shows up across multiple, independently written sources. In Melanesia and parts of the Pacific, early photography was sometimes integrated into existing frameworks around sympathetic magic, the belief that an object connected to a person, hair, nail clippings, personal belongings could be used to affect that person from a distance. A photograph slotted naturally into that existing category. It wasn't a new kind of fear. It was an old fear finding a new object to attach to. And here's a detail that tends to surprise people. This wasn't only a phenomenon in cultures encountering photography for the first time through outside contact. Similar hesitation showed up in parts of rural Europe and America too, well into the era when photography was already common elsewhere. Rural communities with strong folk belief traditions sometimes carried real discomfort around photographs, particularly of children or the ill, tied to older beliefs about the evil eye, about drawing dangerous attention through visibility, about the risk of marking someone as noticeable to forces that preferred people stay unremarkable. The camera wasn't just meeting ancient belief systems in far-off places. It was meeting them in villages a few hours outside major Western cities, too. So now we get to the actual question underneath all of this. Was any of this fear rational? And the honest answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. On the literal level, obviously not. A camera doesn't remove a piece of your soul. Nobody's spiritual essence gets siphoned into a glass plate. That part of the belief doesn't hold up under any modern framework. But zoom out from the literal claim and look at the underlying instinct, and something else is going on. Humans evolved as intensely social creatures whose survival depended heavily on controlling how they were perceived by their group. We've talked about this before on this channel. Ancient humans managed reputation, information, and self-presentation with extraordinary care, because in a small group where everyone knew everyone, your standing in the group was directly tied to your safety and access to resources. Being seen the wrong way by the wrong person could carry real consequences. Managing your own visibility wasn't paranoia. It was survival infrastructure. A photograph, from that lens, is not a neutral copy. It's a piece of information about you that you no longer control. Once it exists, someone else decides who sees it, when, and in what context. Someone else can carry your exact likeness away from you, to places you'll never go, to be looked at by people you'll never meet, possibly long after you're dead. To a mind shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of tightly managed small group reputation, that's not an irrational fear. That's an entirely accurate description of a real loss of control. The soul language is a spiritual translation of something that is, underneath, a genuinely correct read on what a photograph actually does. It takes a piece of your self-presentation and hands control of it to someone else. This is worth sitting with for a second because it reframes the entire belief. The specific mechanism, spiritual soul theft, was almost certainly wrong. But the underlying threat model, a stranger permanently capturing and controlling your image without your ongoing consent, was and is completely real. Ancient people didn't have the vocabulary of consent, image rights, or data ownership. They had the vocabulary of spirits and curses. But they were pointing at the same problem. Which brings us to now, because here's the part that should make you slightly uncomfortable in a very different way. You've probably taken or appeared in dozens, maybe hundreds, of photographs this year alone, most of which now sit somewhere you don't fully control, on servers, in other people's phones, occasionally analyzed by systems you'll never see, sorted by facial recognition into categories you didn't choose. The specific fear our ancestors had, that an image of you could be taken and used in ways you can't predict or prevent, has become dramatically more true in the last 20 years than it was for the previous 2 centuries of photography combined. We didn't grow out of the instinct our ancestors had. We just stopped listening to it. The village elder who refused the first photographer's camera and the person today who feels a flicker of unease before a stranger's phone camera turns toward them uninvited are running the exact same ancient threat assessment. Something is being taken. Someone else now controls a piece of how I'm seen. The elder called it a soul. We call it data. The underlying instinct never actually left. We just built a world that overrides it 100 times a day without asking. So back to that woman in the 1860s, backing away from the camera, warning the others. She wasn't behind. She wasn't confused by technology. She was running an old, accurate piece of human software. The same software that once kept her ancestors' reputations, secrets, and safety intact inside small groups where being seen the wrong way could cost you everything. The camera was new. The instinct that made her flinch from it was not. That's not superstition. That's the oldest privacy instinct we have, finally meeting the machine it had been quietly warning us about the whole time.